So, here we have it. Boccaccio's Decameron, second day, third story. Accompanied by parrots this time, apparently. All right, shall we begin? The whole company, men and ladies alike, listened with admiration to the adventures of Arnaldo de Asti, commending his piety and giving thanks to God and St. Julian, who had come to his rescue in the hour of his greatest need. Nor, moreover, was the lady considered to have acted foolishly, even though nobody openly said so. For the way she had accepted the blessing that God had left on her doorstep, and while everyone was busy talking with half-suppressed mirth about the pleasant night the lady had spent, Pomponea, finding herself next to Philostrato, and realizing rightly that it would be her turn to speak next, collected her thoughts together and started planning what to say. And upon receiving the queen's command, she began in a manner no less confident than it was lively to speak as follows. Excellent ladies, if the ways of fortune are carefully examined, it will be seen that the more one discusses her actions, the more remains to be said. Nor is it surprising when you pause to consider that she controls all the affairs we unthinkingly call our own, and that consequently it is she who arranges and rearranges them after her own inscrutable fashion, constantly moving them now in one direction, now in another, then back again, without following any discernible plan. The truth of this assertion is clearly illustrated by everything that happens in the space of a single day, as well as being borne out by some of the previous stories. Nevertheless, since our Queen has decreed that we should speak on this particular theme, I shall add to the tales already told a story of my own, from which my listeners will possibly derive some profit, and which, in my opinion, ought to prove entertaining. It's kind of interesting when she talks about fortune. She's really not kind of talking about, this is about as far as you can come from God has a plan. It's pretty much, it goes one way, it goes another, and there is basically no discernible logic to it. So this is kind of different for the 14th century. In our city, there once lived a nobleman named Messer Tebaldo, who, according to some people, belonged to the Lamberti family, whilst others maintain that he was an Agolante, perhaps for the simple reason that Tebaldo's son later followed a profession with which the Agolante family has always been associated and which it practices to this day. That's moneylending. But leaving aside the question of which of the two families he belonged, I can tell you that he was one of the wealthiest nobles of his time, and that he had 3 sons, of whom the first was called Lamberto, the second Tebaldo, and the third Agolante. These 3 had grown into fine, mettlesome youths, the eldest being not yet 18 when Messer Tebaldo died, very rich, and they inherited all his lands, houses, and movables. Finding they had come into a vast amount of money and possessions, they began to indulge in a reckless orgy of spending, heedless of everything except their own pleasure. They employed a veritable army of servants, kept large numbers of thoroughbred horses, hounds, and hawks, entertained continuously, gave presents, and entered the list of jousts and tournaments. They engaged not only in all the activities befitting a gentleman, but also in any others falling within the range of their youthful inclinations. However, they had not been leading this sort of life long when the fortune left to them by their father dwindled to nothing. And since their income was inadequate to meet their commitments, they began to pawn and sell their possessions. So busily were they occupied in selling one thing after another that they were scarcely aware of being almost bankrupt. Until one day, their eyes, which had been kept closed by riches, were opened by poverty. Lamberto, therefore, called the others together and pointed to the contrast between their father's splendor and their own sorry condition. He reminded them how rich they had been and how they had fallen into poverty on account of their extravagance. And he encouraged them, with all the strength at his command, to join him in selling what little they still possessed, to go away before the destitution became even more apparent. They agreed to do so, and without the slightest attempt at leave-taking or any other ceremony, they set out from Florence and traveled without pause until they arrived in England. There they took a small house in London, and reducing their spending to an absolute minimum, they began to lend money at a high rate of interest, and their business prospered so well that within a few years they amassed a huge fortune. In consequence, they were able to return one by one to Florence, where they repurchased a large part of their possessions, buying many other things in addition, and they all married. Since they were still lending money in England, they sent a young nephew of theirs, called Alessandro, to manage their business there, while they themselves remained in Florence, having forgotten the parlous condition to which they had previously been reduced by their recklessness, and despite the fact that they now had families to support, they spent with less restraint than ever, borrowing large sums of money and piling up huge debts with every merchant in Florence. For a few years they managed to meet their expenses with the help of the money remitted to them by Alessandro, who had opened up an extremely profitable line of business by offering mortgages to barons on their castles and other properties. The three brothers spent lavishly, and since they could always count on England, they borrowed money whenever they ran short. But suddenly, a totally unexpected war broke out in England between the king and one of his sons, splitting the whole of the island into two rival factions, as a result of which the castles of the barons were taken out of Alessandro's control and all his other assets were frozen. But he remained in the island in the hope that son and father would make peace at any moment, in which case he might recover not only all his capital, but the outstanding interest as well. Meanwhile, in Florence, the three brothers made no attempt whatever to curb their enormous expenditure, but borrowed more and more each day. But as the years went by, one after another, and their expectations were seen to be bearing no fruit, the three brothers lost their sources of credit, and immediately afterwards, since their creditors were demanding payment, they were thrown into prison. Their assets were realized to meet their debts, but the amount they raised was insufficient. And so they remained in prison, leaving their wives and little children to wander off in rags. Some taking to the country, some going to one place, some to another, with nothing but a lifetime of poverty ahead of them. Alessandro, after waiting several years in England for a peace that never came, thought it not only pointless but positively dangerous to stay there any longer, and decided to return to Italy. He set out all alone on his journey, but as he was leaving Bruges, he happened to see, also leaving the city, an abbot dressed in white. He was attended by many monks and preceded by a large number of retainers and a substantial baggage train. Bringing up the rear were two worthy knights, relatives of the king, with whom Alessandro was personally acquainted, and so, having made his presence known, they readily received him as one of their company. As he jogged along beside the two knights, Alessandro made polite inquiries concerning the identity of the monks who were riding ahead with this large retinue of servants, and asked where they were all going. "The person riding up front," replied one of the knights, "is a young relative of ours who has just been appointed abbot of one of the largest abbeys in England. But because he is below the minimum age prescribed by law for this great office, we are going with him to Rome in order to ask the Holy Father to give him dispensation for his excessive youth and confirm him in office. But we wish to keep the matter a secret." Now, you're probably wondering, okay, this young person is going to become an abbot. They're going to be in charge of an abbey. Let's just say some church offices were purchased back then. And so you sometimes found very young aristocrats in positions that they might not have been able to earn so quickly based on merit. Okay, the new abbot rode on, sometimes going ahead, sometimes falling back behind in his retinue, in the style regularly to be observed in gentlemen of quality when they are traveling, until eventually he found himself level with Alessandro. He was very young, exceedingly good-looking and well-built, and the most well-mannered, agreeable, and finely spoken person you can imagine. The abbot's first glimpse of Alessandro gave him more genuine pleasure than anything he had seen in his life. Calling him to his side, he began to converse amicably with him, asking who he was, whence he had come, and whither he was bound. Alessandro answered all his questions frankly, revealing the exact state of his affairs, and placing himself at the abbot's entire disposal for whatever small service he might be able to render. The abbot, on hearing his fine, precise ways of talking and observing his manners more closely, judged him to be a gentleman despite the lowly nature of his past occupation, and became even more enraptured with him. Being filled with compassion by the tale of Alessandro's misfortune, he began to console him in tones of deep affection, telling him not to lose hope, for if he kept his courage, God would not only restore him to the position from which he had been toppled by fortune, but set him even higher. The abbot then said that he too was making for Tuscany, and invited Alessandro to join his party. Alessandro thanked him for his kind words and declared his readiness to do whatever he was asked. So the abbot rode on, becoming more and more fascinated by what he saw of Alessandro, and after a few days they arrived at a small town, not very richly endowed with inns, where the abbot wished to put up for the night. Alessandro persuaded the abbot to dismount at a place run by a very good friend of his, and saw that he was given a room in the most comfortable part of the house. By this time, Alessandro, being a very experienced traveler, had become a sort of major domo to the abbot, and he searched high and low to find accommodation in the town for the whole of the abbot's retinue. Lodging some in one place and some in another, by the time he returned to the inn, the abbot had supped. The hour was very late, and everyone had gone off to bed. He asked the landlord where he could sleep, and the landlord replied, "I really don't know. As you can see, the place is completely full, and my family and I are having to sleep on benches. But in the abbot's room, there are some cupboards for storing grain. If you like, I'll show you where they are and fix you up some sort of a bed, and in there to sleep the night on as best as you can." "How am I to squeeze into the abbot's room?" said Alessandro. "You know how tiny it is. There wasn't even any space in there for a single one of his monks to lie down on the floor. If only I had noticed those cupboards when the abbot's bed curtains were drawn. His monks could have slept in those, and I could have lodged where the monks are staying." "Well, that's how matters stand," said the landlord. "Once you resign yourself to it, you'll sleep like a top in there. The abbot is asleep and the curtains are drawn in front of his bed. I'll slip in quietly, put down a nice mattress for you to sleep on." When he saw that it could all be arranged without disturbing the abbot, Alessandro fell in with the scheme, and making as little noise as possible, he bedded down where the landlord had suggested. The abbot, far from being asleep, was locked in meditation on the subject of certain newly aroused longings of his. He had overheard the conversation between Alessandro and the landlord, and was listening too when Alessandro turned in for the night. "God has answered my prayers," said the abbot delightedly to himself. "If I do not seize this opportunity, it may be a long time before another comes my way." Having firmly made up his mind, he waited for complete silence to descend on the inn. Then he called out to Alessandro in a low voice, and firmly brushing aside the latter's numerous excuses, persuaded him to undress and lie down at his side. The abbot placed one of his hands on Alessandro's chest, and then, to Alessandro's great astonishment, began to caress him in the manner of a young girl fondling her lover, causing Alessandro to suspect, since there seemed to be no other explanation for his extraordinary behavior, that the youth was possibly in the grip of some impure passion. But either by intuition or because of some movement on Alessandro's part, the abbot understood at once what he was thinking and began to smile. Then, hastily tearing off the shirt he was wearing, he took Alessandro's hand and placed it on his bosom, saying, "Stupid. Drive those silly thoughts out of your head, Alessandro." What the? Pardon me a second. So, where was I? Then, hastily tearing off the shirt he was wearing, he took Alessandro's hand and placed it on his bosom, saying, "Drive those silly thoughts out of your head, Alessandro. Lay your hand here and see what I am hiding." And placing his hand on the abbot's bosom, Alessandro discovered a pair of sweet little rounded breasts, as firm and finely shaped as if they were made of ivory. It dawned on him at once that this was a woman, and without awaiting further invitation, he immediately took her in his arms. But just as he was about to kiss her, she said, "Wait. Before you come any closer, there is something I want to tell you. As you can gather, I am not a man but a woman. I am also a virgin, and I set out from home in order to obtain the Pope's permission for my marriage. I know not whether to call it your good fortune or my misfortune, but from the moment I saw you the other day, I burned with a love deeper than woman has ever experienced for any man. Hence, I am resolved to have you as my husband rather than any other. But if you do not want to marry me, you must leave me at once and return to your own place." Alessandro had no idea who she was, but in view of the size of her retinue, he judged her to be a rich noblewoman and could see for himself that she was very beautiful. So without wasting too much time in thought, he replied that if this was what she desired, he was only too ready to oblige. She then sat up in bed, handed him a ring, and made him plight her troth beneath a small picture of our Lord, after which they fell into each other's arms, and for the rest of the night they disported themselves to their great and mutual pleasure. They decided carefully what they should do, and when it was daybreak, Alessandro arose and, retracing his steps, stole away from the room without anyone realizing where he had passed the night. Then, reeling with happiness, he set out once more with the abbot and her retinue, and several days later they arrived in Rome. They had been staying in the city for only a few days when the abbot attended to Alessandro, and the two knights was received in audience by the Pope. Having paid him their respects in the appropriate fashion, the abbot began, "As you, Holy Father, must know better than all others, whoever desires to live a good and honest life is obliged to shun as best he may every possible motive for behaving otherwise. I myself, being one who desires to live a thoroughly honest life, have come all this way in the clothes you see me wearing, ostensibly to seek your holiness's blessing for my marriage. But in reality I have fled, taking with me a considerable part of the treasure belonging to my father, the King of England, for he was planning to marry me to the King of Scotland, who is a very old man, whereas I myself am a young girl, as you can see. What caused me to run away was not so much the King of Scotland's age, as you fear that once married to him, my youthful frailty might tempt me into contravening God's laws and staining the honor of my royal-blooded father. In this frame of mind, I was on my way hither when God, who alone knows best how to measure our needs, being stirred, as I believe, by his compassion, set before my eyes the person he decreed should be my husband. The one I refer to is the young man," and she pointed to Alessandro, "whom you see standing here at my side. It may well be that he is less pure-blooded than a person of royal birth, but both in bearing and in character he is a worthy match for any great lady. He therefore is the man I have taken. It is him that I want, and no matter what my father or anyone else may have to say on the subject, I will never accept any other. The ostensible aim of my journey has thus been removed, but I desire to complete it for two reasons. Firstly, to meet your holiness and visit the venerable and sacred places in which this city abounds, and secondly, so that through your good offices I could make public before you and the whole world the marriage that Alessandro and I have contracted with God as our only witness. What is pleasing to God and to me should not be disagreeable to you, and I therefore beg you in all humility to give us your blessing, armed with which, since you are God's vicar, we should be more certain of his entire approval, and thus we may live our lives together till death do us part, to the greater glory not only of God, but also of yourself. On hearing that his wife was the daughter of the King of England, Alessandro could scarcely contain his astonishment and happiness. But the two knights were even more astonished, and they were so furious that they would have done Alessandro an injury, and possibly the lady as well, if they had been anywhere else but in the Pope's presence. The Pope, for his part, was greatly astonished both by the lady's attire and by her choice of a husband, but he realized there was no turning back and decided to grant her request. He could see, however, that the knights were seething with rage, and so first of all he pacified them and reconciled them with Alessandro and the lady. Then he gave orders for what was to be done. For the appointed day, the Pope arranged a magnificent ceremony to which he had invited all the cardinals and a large number of other great nobles, and he summoned the couple into their presence. The lady, dressed in regal robes and looking very gracious and beautiful, was greeted with unanimous and well-deserved praise, as also was Alessandro. He carried his fine clothes with such a natural and dignified air. Honorably attended by the two knights, he looked more like a royal prince than a young man who had once been engaged in money-lending. Without further ado, the Pope had taken them solemnly through the marriage ceremony from the beginning. Then a sumptuous wedding feast was held, after which he dismissed them with his blessing. On leaving Rome, it was the wish of both Alessandro and his bride that they should make for Florence, where their story had already been noised abroad. There the townspeople received them with all possible honor, and the three brothers were released from prison on petition of the lady, who had seen that all their creditors were paid. She then settled the brothers and their wives once more in their estates, after which, as Alessandro and his wife took their leave of all concerned, and taking Agolante with them, they set out from Florence to Paris, where they were handsomely received by the king. From Paris, the two knights went on ahead to England, where they worked on the king to such good effect that he pardoned the princess and gave a magnificent welcome both to her and to his son-in-law, on whom, with great pomp and ceremony, he shortly afterwards conferred a knighthood, creating him Earl of Cornwall for good measure. Being a very astute and capable man, Alessandro brought great benefit to the island by reconciling father and son, consequently winning the affection and gratitude of the entire population. At the same time, Agolante recovered all their money down to the last penny and returned to Florence immensely rich, having first been given a knighthood by Earl Alessandro. As for the Earl, he lived a life of great renown with his lady. Indeed, there are those who maintain that partly through his own ability and intelligence, and partly with the help of his father-in-law, he later conquered Scotland and was crowned her king. And that's the end of the story. If you're trying to figure out which king of England and which king of Scotland this is, don't try. The British Islands are as remote for Boccaccio in the 14th century as the Forbidden City in China is for Puccini when he's writing Turandot in the early 20th century. It's just speculation. So, anyway, there's also a chicken apparently. But it's interesting because one of the things about this, this is in the 14th century, we're having a clear reference to potential homosexuality with the abbot, the young abbot who's supposed to be a young man, and Alessandro, another young man, and the fact that they use male pronouns for the abbot until the abbot's real identity is revealed. But, nope, not in this story. Not saying it's not going to happen later in the book, but not in this story. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the story, and that's that. So, how do I stop this? There we go.